Subtitling Zweites, Deutsches Fernsehen 2/5/2026. It's the fourth year day 347 since the full-scale invasion began. Welcome. Here is the situation report. In today's report, we see serious criticism and voices against the Ukrainian commander Sirsky, the ongoing Stalin-style war, and a Ukrainian attack on Russian launch sites of the Orychnik medium-range missile. Take a look at this Russian soldier. The drone is flying over an area with fallen soldiers, and suddenly he reacts and starts shooting at the drone. Of course, he pretended to be dead, which makes sense, but why didn't he do it for longer? Or why didn't he start shooting earlier? The problem is that the drone appears closer and larger than if it were farther away, and theoretically, you could hit it more easily then. However, you also shouldn't forget that they often explode, and the closer they are to someone, the more likely you are to get hurt. But from the way it looks in this video, he missed anyway. Drones are and will remain simply useful helpers. Imagine if Ukrainian infantry had to search this forest. One could have pretended to be dead and possibly hit a Ukrainian soldier. Here we see another drone flying into a shelter housing the Russian T-62 tank, which would have been protected from artillery. But you can see for yourself that this is not just a makeshift shelter, and that the shelter was actually built with quite a lot of effort. But drones are able to get in here as well because they're so maneuverable, unlike an artillery shell, which comes in ballistically. The talks between Ukrainians and Russians are nearly fruitless again. Why nearly? We'll explain soon. Russia continues to demand the maximum, and Ukraine is not willing to accept that. Russia considers international recognition of the Donbass as Russian territory to be a central part of any possible agreement. That's what's being discussed about a ceasefire, according to state news agency TASS, citing a negotiation source. According to this, it is very important for Moscow that all countries carry out this recognition, which of course makes enforcement much more difficult. If not even Ukraine recognizes the cession of Donbass, how are other countries supposed to do so? This position definitely underscores for us that Russia currently has no realistic intentions for peace. Rather than discussing a ceasefire, security guarantees, or withdrawal, the Kremlin demands maximal territorial claims as a precondition, not for peace, but as the precondition itself. Don't mistake the precondition for peace. It's just a ceasefire. To give up a large part of the territory, especially where there are many defensive structures, and then hope that there will be peace is, of course, absolutely grotesque. So it remains as it has been so far. But why did I say earlier that this brings almost nothing? Well, what they were able to agree on quickly was another prisoner exchange, in which 150 Ukrainian soldiers and 7 civilians who were in Russian captivity were released. Captivity on the Russian side is anything but pleasant. We often see how emaciated the returning soldiers look, but as you can see in this video here, the reaction of family members who can see their children again after more than 3 years of uncertainty has been enormous. From the location cross, there is a video of a Russian convoy consisting of some captured vehicles like the M113, which was destroyed today. But that's not all that's happening here. Russians seize central Krasny Liman, increasing pressure on Rudinsky. In general, however, things are relatively quiet when it comes to territorial gains. You can already see that in the recent situation reports from the past few months. But quiet isn't always a good thing. It also shows our side isn't making progress at the front, which relates to an important topic. Almost 2 years after Sirsky was appointed as the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, more and more voices are now calling for his replacement. The timing is sensitive. Russian forces are near Sloviansk with added pressure on Zaporizhia and Pokrovsk. Against this backdrop, a sober assessment is being made. When Sirsky took over the position and replaced Saluzhny, The front line was much further to the east. Avdiivka was still defended. Vuhledar and Krasnohorivka were strongholds. Toretsk remained stable, and fighting continued near Lyman. The situation was tough, but a bit more organized. However, with the change in leadership, there were extensive personnel cuts. A large part of the general staff and several experienced commanders were also replaced. As a result, there were friction losses at the front, problematic rotations, and the loss of individual positions. The criticism focuses less on territorial loss and more on the gains to losses ratio. Sirsky's leadership was long seen as rooted in Soviet doctrine. He had already often gained a reputation as an extremely strong defender, no matter the cost. Repeatedly, counterattacks on well-prepared Russian positions were ordered, retreats were extremely delayed, and units were held until the brink of encirclement. And that's something I've often brought up myself, even with his change in leadership. This practice led to large and heavy losses, and to the lasting weakening of several units. For example, the 47th Brigade, which we've barely heard about for months. Under Solushny, for example, they were very active. Even before his appointment, he handled the area, and Bakhmut lost several brigades under his command, which delayed the fall of Bakhmut, but didn't really decide anything. In addition, there is the structural imbalance. In 2025, Sirsky created new units directly under his command, which were given priority for personnel and Western equipment. At the same time, however, many other mechanized brigades, some with only 30% of their intended strength, were severely depleted, some even without any main battle tanks at all. There were also repeated complaints that he engaged in micromanagement and simply bypassed chains of command. For example, he is said to have personally ordered where individual trenches should be dug, although that was actually the responsibility of the platoon leaders, and he wasn't even on site, nor would this task even fall under his area of responsibility. Territorial defense units are even more poorly equipped because of his decisions, as he used the resources for a very small group of directly subordinate units. Critics view this as favoritism toward loyal elite units over the broader army. The Kursk operation is seen as an initially successful operational highlight, but that was more of a Russian mistake that brought this success, rather than a well-planned Ukrainian operation under Sirsky's command. And when Russia stabilized after many weeks and brought in reinforcements, a timely withdrawal did not happen. Holding the territory again caused heavy losses with no strategic reason, as the operation lacked purpose. Meanwhile, Russia continued its advances in the east. We've seen the result now. Another difference compared to Solushny is also in the way voluntary units are handled. While this integration and consensus was being sought, Sirsky relied on strong discipline. Key units were disbanded or their leaders replaced, greatly reducing willingness for open situation assessment. For these reasons, many are now calling for his resignation or a change in leadership, since Ukraine is unlikely to achieve significant differences at the front by 2026 anyway. Capable leaders are needed for that. However, a quick change now could also lead to a lot of restructuring again, which could push an offensive back to next year, or maybe prevent it from happening at all. The Stalin war between Elon Musk and the Russian army continues. Yesterday, SPACEX reportedly activated all Stalin communication terminals used by Russian forces. This caused massive anger and open complaints in Russian military circles and relevant channels, which further supports the credibility of the report. A new whitelisting system was introduced, as hinted last week after Musk spoke with Ukraine representatives. The background to this was that Russia was also using the terminals to attack civilian targets. War operations can now only proceed if properly registered and activated through Ukrainian channels. Unauthorized devices automatically lose connection, especially during mobile operations. In response to this, it has been reported, among other things, that the extremist Russian group, Rusish, now wants to use improvised Wi-Fi bridges to replace Stalin. But of course, you can't replace them that way. It's another option, but it comes with many disadvantages. Because Russia, or rather, Russian soldiers made Stalin the central element, not just an addition. failed or unreliable military radio networks, which they still haven't brought under control. If this system fails, mobile combat elements like drone units, artillery observers, and mobile forces will break down. Their abilities for timing, communication, and fire correction. We once took a look at a Russian drone control station. There are a few soldiers sitting in a bunker or in an improvised position with several monitors, and they can then see the live feed from. Then they can coordinate new orders or new attacks. And all of this always ran via Discord and Starlink to ensure communication. The current alternatives, such as Wi-Fi bridges, are not operationally comparable. They have a limited range, need fixed relay points, are highly vulnerable to electronic interference, and can be easily located and targeted by radio reconnaissance. They also force units to be more static, making them vulnerable to drones, artillery, and precision strikes. A flexible mobile communication system quickly turns into a rigid, vulnerable makeshift solution. Meanwhile, Lukashenko is being shown another communication system, which I'll call a Starlink alternative for now. The crucial question now is whether Russia will turn to Lukashenko in this situation and try to switch to the Belarusian alternative. I mean, it's less about real technical equivalence to Starlink, but rather an attempt to integrate a politically controllable substitute system in order to at least compensate for part of the lost communication capability. However, such a step would be more of an admission of dependence than a solution that Belarus would have, so it's hardly comparable. According to several reports from recent weeks, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has also confirmed repeated attacks on the Russian missile test and launch site in Yar near Astrakhan. Russian wonder weapons, especially the Orychnik, were stationed there. Reports say the attack scored significant hits. Although I would prefer to wait for some more satellite images, not just the ones released by the Ukrainians, Flamingo cruise missiles were reportedly used in the attacks as well. The information isn't officially confirmed, but it's possible since the range and mission profile match the target. In a separate video, the launch of Flamingo cruise missiles can also be seen, but without the beginning. If this information is confirmed, then the missile launch site would have been hit as a high-value target. The site is used by Russia, among other things, for testing and preparing missile launches, and therefore has both military and symbolic significance. Putin can't use nuclear weapons, so he relies on the Orychnik. Thanks to all subscribers, channel members, and the Algo crew, especially Lieutenant Colonels Renica and Titch. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next Situation Report.